Every empire tells the same bedtime story. Our money is different. Our system is solid. Our promises will outlive you, your children, and their children too. Romans heard it. French citizens under the king and then under the Revolution heard it. Southerners in the Confederacy heard it. Depositors in modern Lebanon heard it. And then, one ordinary morning, a statement that looked safe the night before had become a museum piece, a snapshot of a world that no longer existed. Savings turned into wallpaper, salaries turned into jokes. The sense of a stable future dissolved into the simple question, how do I eat next week? Collapse is not some weird exception history occasionally throws at us. Collapse is the default destination when trust is stretched past its breaking point. The unsettling truth is that financial systems fail in more ways than we can count. Sometimes slowly, like a leaking ship that everyone pretends is fine. Sometimes all at once, like a floor giving way beneath a crowded room. The real question is never, will this system last forever? It's, when it cracks, where will you be standing? The most dangerous financial mistake isn't buying the wrong stock or misreading a chart. It's believing that the numbers on your banking app are carved into stone. We look at our balances and our national currencies as if they are part of the landscape, like mountains or oceans. But money is not geology. Money is trust, between you and your bank, between citizens and their state, between nations and the wider world. And trust is fragile. It can evaporate in a single announcement, a missed payment, a policy shock, or a moment when enough people decide, all at once, I don't believe this anymore. That's why history, as brutal as it can be, is also a survival manual. Every monetary collapse leaves behind wreckage, but also a pattern. If you look closely, you see the same choices, the same temptations, the same blind spots repeating over and over, with different flags and faces. You also see who walks out the other side, less damaged, sometimes even stronger. It is almost never the people who believed the loudest. It is the ones who started doubting a little earlier than everyone else. Take the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that refused to die for nearly 1,000 years after the West fell. At the center of its power was a small, heavy disk of gold, the solidus. For centuries, this coin was so reliable that merchants from Italy to Egypt to the Silk Road treated it almost like physics. You didn't argue with its value. If a deal was priced in solidi, you knew what you were getting. In a world without spreadsheets or rating agencies, the coin itself was the rating. It was, in practice, the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. And here's the haunting part. The Byzantines knew Rome had destroyed its own silver denarius by quietly mixing in base metals, turning a proud imperial coin into a thin silver coating over cheap metal. You would think that having watched that slow-motion suicide, they would treat the purity of their gold as sacred. For centuries they did. Then, little by little, they didn't. Under pressure, military defeats, shrinking territory, rising costs, emperors began to do what rulers always promise they'll never do. They shaved the purity of the solidus, stretched the gold further, mixed it with cheaper alloys. At first, the change was subtle, almost invisible. Only goldsmiths and foreigners watching closely could sense that something was off. But trust is like a crystal glass. Once you see a crack, you never drink the same way again. Traders started discounting the coin. Foreign partners demanded more pieces of gold for the same goods. Contracts written assuming one quality of money were suddenly being settled in another. The solidus, once an anchor of Mediterranean trade, turned into just another political story. The emperor needed people to believe. Debasement didn't just change the metal, it changed the psychology. Once people realized the rules could be rewritten quietly, the spell was broken. Who came out ahead in that world? Not the citizens who kept all their wealth in the coins the state minted and the state debased. It was the merchants who had quietly moved a portion of their savings into things the emperor could not counterfeit: raw gold, silver, foreign coins, land along trade routes, warehouses full of grain or textiles. They didn't need anyone's promise to know what those things were worth. That's the first hard, recurring lesson history offers. Governments are almost never able to resist the temptation to water down their own money, especially when the bill for past decisions comes due. And when they do, value doesn't disappear. It migrates. It flees into assets outside their control. But not every collapse begins with a mint playing games with metal. Sometimes the blow is external, sudden, and indiscriminate. In the mid-14th century, Europe met such a blow: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, waves of plague ripped across the continent and killed, by some estimates, half of its people. Entire streets lost every inhabitant. Monasteries emptied. Trade routes went silent. To the people living through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Yet beneath the horror, the economic map was being redrawn. When half of your workforce vanishes, labor stops being cheap. The survivors could suddenly walk away from abusive landlords or demand higher wages. Fields went unplowed, houses stood empty, and land that for generations had been priced beyond the reach of common families was now begging for buyers or tenants. If you were alive, healthy enough to work, and had even modest reserves, some silver, stored grain, tools, or livestock, you were in a position that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The world had turned into a macabre buyer's market. If that dynamic feels uncomfortably familiar, it should. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a high-tech echo of the same logic. Instead of horse-drawn carts and plague ships, we had cargo containers stuck in ports and factories shut down overnight. Supply chains snapped. Governments around the world opened the monetary floodgates, and trillions of new units of currency were summoned into existence to keep the machine from seizing. Asset prices, especially in housing and stocks, rocketed back up and beyond, while millions of people whose only asset was their labor scrambled just to keep up with rent and groceries. Once again, those who entered the crisis with liquidity and assets bought what others, under pressure, were forced to sell. The rhyme is clear across 7 centuries. Pandemics and large shocks don't just kill people. They reshuffle the hierarchy of who owns what. They tend to reward those who have reserves, cash, food, skills, or connections, and punish those who live right up against the edge. History is not fair. It never promised to be. If disease shows us how fast an external shock can flip an economy, Renaissance Florence shows us how fragile even the most sophisticated financial institutions really are. In the 1340s, Florence was Europe's Wall Street, a city whose banking families financed kings, popes, and long-distance trade. Names like Bardi and Peruzzi carried enormous prestige. Their houses had offices from London to Constantinople. Ordinary Florentines could be forgiven for thinking, if my money is with them, it's as safe as money can be. Those banks made a familiar bet. They lent heavily to a powerful government, in this case Edward III of England, to fund his expensive wars. As long as the king paid, everyone prospered. But kings do what over-leveraged borrowers always do when reality catches up. They default. Edward simply stopped paying. The effect was like pulling a keystone out of an arch. The great Florentine houses buckled and then collapsed. Depositors were wiped out. Trade contracts fell apart. A city that had felt invincible discovered that too big to fail is a story bankers tell right up until the day they do. This is not some quaint medieval problem. The same script played out with Lehman Brothers in 2008, with regional banks in 2023, with Lebanon's financial elite promising safety before the doors locked. Institutions exist to make a profit, not to guarantee your survival. Their promises are solid only until honoring them becomes more painful than breaking them. After that,
You are a line item to be restructured. The people who weathered Florence's crash best were not the ones with the fanciest relationships at the grandest banks. They were those who had kept part of their wealth outside the system entirely: land, goods, foreign coin, or networks that allowed them to trade even when the city's proudest institutions were in ruins. By this point in the story, a pattern should be starting to form in your mind. Gold coins, plague years, Florentine ledgers, they look like different worlds, but they are all teaching the same quiet, uncomfortable lesson. The things we assume are permanent pillars of our financial lives are, in reality, made of trust and habit. And when that trust wavers, they crumble fast. In the next chapter, we'll cross the ocean to a far more familiar setting, America's own experiments with printing money and breaking it, and see how quickly a modern, educated society can repeat the oldest mistakes on Earth. America likes to think of itself as a young country, too modern and sophisticated to repeat the mistakes of medieval emperors and Florentine bankers. But the Civil War stripped that illusion away. Beneath the cannon smoke and moral struggle over slavery, both the Union and the Confederacy hit the same hard wall. You can't fight an industrial-scale war with peacetime tax revenue. When bullets, railroads, and uniforms needed to be paid for, each side reached for the tool that always feels like magic at first: printing more claims on wealth than the real economy can support. In the North, that magic took the form of greenbacks, paper notes backed not by gold in the vault, but by the full faith and credit of the United States. At first, they felt like patriotic badges, physical proof that citizens and government were united in a righteous cause. But as more and more of them poured into circulation, the math did what it always does. Each note bought a little less. Prices crept higher. A soldier on leave might find that the pay he'd risked his life for now barely covered boots and a train ticket home. Confidence in the new paper floated up and down with every battlefield rumor and political speech. South of the lines, the Confederacy was running the same experiment with far worse odds. Cut off from many trade routes, short on industry, desperate for weapons and food, Confederate leaders printed graybacks in a flood. There was no deep tax base to lean on, no long-established credit history with foreign lenders. So the presses ran and ran and ran. By the final years of the war, the numbers printed on the notes were less a measure of value and more a sign of panic. A month's salary could barely buy a sack of flour. Families lugged bundles of bills to market and came home with almost nothing. By 1865, Confederate money didn't just depreciate, it ceased to exist as money at all. It became historical trash, colorful scraps you might keep in a drawer as a sad souvenir. What survived that inferno of broken promises were not the carefully hoarded stacks of currency, but hard, stubborn realities: land, livestock, warehouses of food or cotton, gold and silver coins hidden away, and, for some, political connections that turned defeat into new opportunities. For countless ordinary Southerners, though, a lifetime of savings dissolved in front of them.
America had already lived through a full-scale currency death, but modern Americans rarely talk about it as anything more than a historical footnote. Across the Atlantic, revolutionary France discovered its own version of the same law. In the 1790s, as the monarchy fell and church lands were seized, the new regime believed it had found an elegant solution to its financial chaos. It would issue assignats, paper notes backed by the vast value of confiscated property. On paper, it was brilliant. Convert land you can't easily sell into liquid money that can pay soldiers, buy grain, keep the revolution alive. But once again, the temptation was irresistible. Every time the government faced a new crisis, the answer was to print more assignats. Each fresh wave of paper quietly diluted the last. At first, shopkeepers grumbled but accepted them. Then prices began to gallop ahead of wages.
Farmers who had something the city could not print, food, simply started refusing paper and demanded silver, goods, or nothing at all. In Paris, bread lines lengthened, riots flared, and a revolution that promised liberty found itself strangled by its own currency. The assignat collapsed into worthlessness. The people who came through with their wealth intact were not those who clung to the newest promises of the state, but those who held what the state could not conjure out of thin air: land outside the hottest zones of politics, gold and silver hidden from requisition, storehouses of grain or goods. 2 centuries later, on the other side of the world, the costumes changed, but the mechanism stayed eerily familiar. In 1997, Thailand's baht became the first domino in what the world would come to know as the Asian financial crisis. For years, governments and corporations in Southeast Asia had borrowed heavily in US dollars, convinced that their rapid growth and fixed exchange rates made the risk manageable. As long as their own currencies stayed pegged tightly to the dollar, paying back foreign loans seemed simple. But pegs are just promises wearing a suit. When speculation, slowing growth, and political doubts piled up, the Thai peg snapped. The baht plunged. Debts that had been manageable when one baht bought a stable slice of a dollar suddenly doubled or tripled in local terms. Investors fled. Contagion spread to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia. Currency charts that once drifted gently began to look like cliffs. Factories closed, unemployment skyrocketed, and ordinary families saw the cost of imported goods and dollar loans explode. The people who orchestrated the flows of capital, the hedge funds and global banks, absorbed hits and moved on. Many even returned later to buy distressed assets at bargain prices. The ones who truly drowned were households and businesses trapped in debt denominated in someone else's money. A mortgage or a loan that looked sensible in 1995 became a life sentence in 1998. Nations that had seemed like miracle stories were suddenly at the mercy of the International Monetary Fund, accepting harsh austerity terms in exchange for emergency support. What looked like a regional currency panic was, in practice, a massive transfer of ownership from local hands into the portfolios of global creditors who still held the strong currency everyone needed. Hidden inside this crisis is one of the most merciless rules in finance. Debt in a foreign currency is like oxygen underwater. It works perfectly right up until it doesn't, and then there is no time to adjust. When the exchange rate moves, the creditor can wait. The debtor cannot. This is why so many of history's collapses, from Latin America in the 1980s to parts of Europe after 2010, feel less like accidents and more like slow-motion traps snapping shut. The math of leverage does not care about flags. By now, the pattern stretching from Byzantium to Bangkok is hard to ignore. States that promise stability eventually reach for the printing press.
Revolutions that swear they represent the people end up destroying the people's savings. Booming economies borrow in other people's money until the boom stalls and the bill arrives. In every case, the majority discovers too late that what they thought was safety, a trusted currency, a respected bank, an admired government plan, was a story with an expiration date. And yet, these are not just cautionary tales from some distant, less sophisticated past. In our own century, people with smartphones and PhDs have stood in front of locked bank doors, holding checkbooks and debit cards that no longer mattered. In the next part, we step into that world: modern Lebanon, post-2008 America, the age of quantitative easing, and bank runs that happen at the speed of a tweet. And we ask the question most people avoid until it is too late. In an era of digital money and invisible inflation, what actually survives when the system blinks error? In Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, that abstract fear of system failure stopped being theoretical and started standing in front of people in the street. For years, Lebanese banks had presented themselves as modern, sophisticated, plugged into global markets. Interest rates were generous, marketing was slick, and for many families, a bank account felt like the only safe place in a region scarred by war and instability. Then, almost overnight, the mask slipped. As the country's debt burden exploded and confidence collapsed, banks quietly imposed withdrawal limits. At first, it was framed as temporary, a technical measure. Then, branches simply refused to release deposits. People showed up at the same marble counters, where they had been offered coffee and smiles, only to be told that their life savings were now numbers on a screen that could not be touched. The Lebanese pound began to fall, then plunge, then crash. Prices in local currency soared, while wages stayed stuck. Pensions built over decades lost more than 90% of their purchasing power. A teacher, a doctor, a shop owner who had done everything right suddenly found themselves poorer than their grandparents. Some depositors were so desperate they resorted to armed standoffs inside bank lobbies, not to rob them, but to demand their own money back. The world watched the footage and gasped, as if this were some unimaginable breakdown. But history had seen this movie before, just on different sets with different costumes. The cruel truth that Lebanon forced into daylight is one most people still prefer not to think about. Your deposit is not a treasure chest with your name on it. Legally, it is a loan to a leveraged institution that may or not be able or willing to honor that claim in a crisis. The fine print has always said this. We just don't read it because trust is more comfortable than fear. When the system buckles, the rule is simple. The institution protects itself first, then its largest and most politically connected clients, and only then, if anything remains, the ordinary saver. The people who walked away with some measure of safety in Lebanon weren't magicians. They were the minority who had quietly kept value outside the local banking system. Dollars in foreign accounts, gold and property that couldn't be bailed in, or even literal cash at home when everyone else called that paranoid. If this still feels like a distant problem, remember how recent American history rhymes with it. In 2008, it wasn't deposit accounts that vanished, it was home equity and retirement funds. For years, banks, rating agencies, and politicians had treated rising housing prices as a law of nature. Mortgage-backed securities were marketed as safe, sophisticated, almost boring. Then defaults rose, confidence cracked, and the entire structure began to wobble. In a matter of months, millions of Americans watched their homes repossessed, their 401ks gutted, their job prospects vanish. The institutions that engineered the crisis were deemed systemically important and showered with emergency support. Ordinary families who had simply signed the forms placed in front of them were told that market discipline had to be respected. A decade later, when the COVID pandemic hit, the response took a different form but carried the same DNA. To prevent an economic heart attack, governments and central banks unleashed trillions in freshly created money. Stimulus checks and emergency aid reached households, but the largest and fastest gains accrued higher up the financial food chain. Asset markets roared back long before wages did. Stocks, real estate, and speculative tech soared, while the price of groceries and rent crept steadily upward. Once again, those who already owned scarce assets saw their net worth expand on the back of new money. Those living paycheck to paycheck discovered that the cost of everything essential had quietly sprinted ahead of their incomes. By 2023, Americans got a preview of how quickly confidence can vanish in a world where bank runs happen on apps instead of in lines around the block. A few ugly balance sheets, a flurry of viral posts, and regional banks found themselves hemorrhaging deposits at a speed no 20th century regulator ever had to contemplate. Over a single weekend, institutions that had seemed mundane and solid were either rescued, merged, or effectively wiped out. The phrase "too big to fail," born in the 1980s and immortalized in 2008, revealed its dark punchline. It really means too important to the system to be allowed to fail in a messy way. It does not mean your money is safe no matter what. That gap between perception and reality is where ordinary savers get crushed. So what actually protects you when the stories crack? History refuses to give us a comforting one-size-fits-all answer. In Byzantium, the lifeboat was gold held outside the emperor's reach. After the Black Death, it was liquid savings and the courage to buy abandoned land. In Renaissance Florence, it was skepticism toward glamorous, overextended banks. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods that fed people or sheltered them when paper turned to joke. In revolutionary France, it was food and property, not patriotic notes. In Asia in 1997, it was avoiding debt in a currency you couldn't print. In Lebanon, it was escaping the local system before the door locked. The specifics change, but the pattern underneath is stubborn. Survival belongs to those who hold something real when confidence evaporates. There is another pattern layered on top of that one, and it is more uncomfortable to face. Collapse is not just destruction, it is also redistribution. For the unprepared, it is tragedy. Generations of work wiped out in a few vicious weeks. For those holding reserves and optionality, it becomes a moment when assets change hands at fractions of their former price. After the Black Death, peasants who had never dreamed of owning land suddenly found nobles begging them to farm it on generous terms. After 2008, investors with cash scooped up foreclosed homes and distressed companies. History is full of these grim bargains, where someone's ruin becomes someone else's entry point. You don't have to celebrate that dynamic to acknowledge it, and to ask yourself which side of that transfer you are likely to stand on when the next storm hits. But if you listen closely, the survivors of history are not just the ones with vaults and deeds. They are the ones who could still do something other people needed when the numbers stopped adding up. The baker who could keep turning flour into bread. The mechanic who could repair broken machines when imports dried up. The farmer who knew how to coax food from tired soil. The merchant who understood how to move goods quietly across borders and capital controls. In our era, that might be the programmer who can build tools others rely on, the doctor or nurse whose skills never go out of demand, the small entrepreneur who can pivot quickly when supply chains seize. Money can be printed, skills cannot. Production is the last language of value that systems cannot fake for long. That might be the deepest safeguard history offers, a blend of real assets, real skills, and a clear-eyed understanding that every institution, no matter how polished, is built on human promises. Promises can be broken by desperation, by incompetence, or by design. If all of your security lives inside those promises, a salary from a single employer, savings in a single currency, trust in a single banking system, you are, whether you realize it or not, making a very concentrated bet on a story you do not control. Every major collapse we've walked through tells the same quiet truth. Crises are not random lightning strikes. They are the moments when the gap between what people believe and what the system can actually deliver becomes too wide to hide. When that gap snaps, the transfer begins. From savers to debtors, from citizens to states, from the many who held paper to the few who held something solid. You cannot stop that pattern by wishing it away, but you can choose not to stand in the most vulnerable place when it repeats. So the real question is no longer, will the money system fail? It already has, again and again, in different costumes and on different continents. The question is whether, when the next story of stability starts to tear at the edges, you will be left clutching promises or holding something real, assets that serve human needs, skills that create value, and the freedom that comes from seeing through the illusion before everyone else does. If this changed how you see your own balance sheet, your own career, your own country's currency, then don't just nod and move on. Stay curious. Study the collapses everyone else has already forgotten, because history doesn't just record what was lost. It quietly marks the path of those who made it through. If you want to keep tracing that path, to see how past disasters point straight at the blind spots of our present, you know what to do. Subscribe, come back, and we'll keep walking through the ruins together, looking not just for warnings, but for the tools that actually survive when money fails.